thinking about the parts, I didn't set this whole activity up for us today, but often I do this activity with teachers and I ask them to think about the claim, the evidence, and the reasoning. What's the purpose of those parts, and then what's the complexity? And so the claim can be complex because kids need to make a claim that's relevant and coherent. And the evidence can be complex because it has to be true or accurate, and it has to be related to the claim. And the reasoning is complex because it needs to be logical and it needs to explain why the evidence matters for the claim. But in science class, the evidence has to be grounded in science. And so I'm going to show you a clip from Bozeman Science where he talks about how do you get kids to come up with that scientific piece, and then you help them make that part of their reasoning. And so when I saw this, and I had talked to some other MyStar staff who had started thinking about including scientific principle in the claim evidence reasoning, it was like, in my teacher brain, I was like, all right, this I can work with. So if you would just take a look at this clip. I think it's maybe 2 minutes long. It's part of a longer 8 or 9 minute YouTube video from Paul Anderson, who I think is wonderful. But anyway, he kind of talks about how, getting kids to do that reasoning is hard and how you can help them do it by framing the claim.
Claim is an answer to a question that's asked. Evidence is going to be what you gather, empirical evidence that's gathered in the lab or through research. And then reasoning is going to be a logical connection between the evidence and the claim that you're trying to make. Now, students will generally do really good at the evidence gathering, but they fall down when it comes to this logical connection. And so a good tip is to make sure that your reasoning is based in some kind of a scientific definition, rule, principle. That's a way that in science we can all agree on that. Now, what should a teacher provide? A teacher should simply provide a good question and a way to answer that question. So let's say in the science classroom I give my students a bunch of dice, but they're different looking dice. They're skew dice that look like this. And I ask them the following question. Are these skew dice fair? Now they could start gathering evidence right away. They could roll the dice a bunch of times. We could measure the dice, look at their center of gravity, maybe measure all of the sides to make sure that they're all the same. But before we jump in and start doing evidence, make sure that you've actually framed the question and you understand what's being asked. Make sure that you could define everything that's in this question itself. I'm sure you know what skew dice is, but are we all in agreement with what it is to be fair? Well, let's define it. Fair is this idea that each side has an equal probability of ending up on top. Now, once we have that definition, you can use that in that logical connection. Let's get to an actual science question that we could answer. Is air matter? That's a question you could answer in the science laboratory. Before we dig in and start gathering evidence, however, we should frame the question and make sure that we understand what every term in there means. So what is air? Air is an invisible substance that surrounds the earth. What is matter? Matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. What else do we know about matter? It can be neither created nor destroyed. So sometimes it's helpful at the beginning to get all of these listed out so that we can use them at a later date. Now,
all right. So, and that's a great video if you want to watch the rest of it. I linked it here. But that whole idea of identifying the common science principle that we all agree on, and then using that to help make that connection between the claim and the evidence when you're doing your reasoning. It was like, okay, I think we can do this. And so then I try to verify it, going back to the appendix from the framework. And sure enough, one of the bullets under constructing explanations for middle school says students should construct a scientific explanation based on valid and reliable evidence obtained from sources, including students' own experiments, and based on the assumption that theories and laws that describe the natural world operate today as they did in the past and will continue to do so in the future. So identify those science principles. So what we decided to do in our off-the-shelf lesson is just modify that framework a little bit. And so we're going to ask kids right up front to identify those science principles. Or we can scaffold it and just give them the science principles. But then using the science principle combined with the evidence to help them support the claim all of a sudden becomes a lot more reasonable. So this is actually the check your progress activity from the off-the-shelf lesson. And so you can open up this link. Oh, it's going to ask you to make a copy, which is fine. And so we have a scenario here where Jamal is going to mix baking soda and vinegar to see what happens. And of course, the baggie gets puffed up. And so we've got lots of data here, lots of information and some observations. He measures it before and after. So there's our scenario. And then on slide 18, this is what we give kids. We give them the CER framework, and some of it's scaffolded. So we go ahead and give them the claim, go ahead and identify the principles, and we give them some prompts in the reasoning. So I'm going to put you back in your group, and using that scenario, can you identify the evidence and then write the reasoning statement? And so just give that a try and see how that feels. All right, thanks. So you guys did a great job. When I do this in larger groups, the difference between the wide variety of reasoning statements with my dad is an alien, and then with this activity, there's a huge difference. With this activity, people's responses are pretty standard, right? Which I find as a classroom teacher, okay, this makes sense to me. Now I can evaluate and assess kids in some reasonable way. But can you guys give me some feedback? Is this something that you've already been doing? Is this something that makes sense to you? Would this work in your classroom? What do you think?
I've never done the scientific principles aspect of it. Like, it's always kind of understood that, when we did our natural selection adaptation unit and we were writing up a CER statement, and I'm like, okay, let's see how we can use these ideas, but I never have them identify it. We have it on our sheet here. It's kind of like that box that's there, but it makes sense because they should be applying what they've been learning and use the science. So I'm willing to kind of add that in there. What have we learned so far in this unit that we think, I mean, I don't want to say that we think we can use, but at least to have it out there that they know it and it's not, they're just making a better connection to why are we doing this?
I like the idea of having those scientific principles there because I think it is like you said, Laura, what they're learning. So they're getting down those concepts they're learning and then tying it all together to this new situation.
Thanks. I mean, that's kind of how I felt about it when we started doing this. I'm like, okay, now this makes sense. Instead of just assuming that kids will pull that out of their heads, let's identify it up front, right? What's the harm? And I know that this, with all those prompts, this becomes really pretty formulaic, but, if you think about how language arts teachers teach kids to write a 5-sentence paragraph or a 5-paragraph essay, people don't start out being really sophisticated writers. You start out giving kids kind of a framework. Here's your introduction, 3 supports, and a conclusion, right? So I look at this as, this is a writing process kind of we're going through. And we want kids eventually to write in a much more sophisticated way, and maybe just pull in those scientific principles automatically, but it's probably not going to happen, without some support like this. And so there's lots of ways you can scaffold the CER depending on what you want kids to work on too. I'd highly recommend give them parts of it but maybe focus on 1 or 2 pieces that you really want to improve. And language arts teachers will do that too. They'll say, we're focusing on, using transitions today. So they don't worry about, assessing every single thing the kid wrote, but they are working on how did they write their transition. So, I would encourage people to go ahead and give kids the claim or give them the scientific principle Or, at minimum, give them, some of those prompts. So you can use sentence starters, list one piece of evidence as an example, or sometimes, you can list multiple pieces of evidence and have kids just select the evidence that fits. Like if you really want to work on helping kids select the evidence that is appropriate to support the claim, you can give them 4 or 5 pieces and say pick out the 2 that are the most related or something like that. So those are just some ideas of scaffolding, but I really think it really helped me to think about this as, this is a writing process. We're helping kids to write, and they need some framework and structure in order to get used to doing this to the point where they could be sophisticated, maybe by the time they're in high school. All right. So argumentation, then I have had lots of conversations with the scientists at Michigan Tech and MyStar about the difference between the two. And it's hard for them to differentiate. I mean, it's really kind of part of the same thought process, and it seems like the same thing in a lot of people's minds. And yet they're 2 separate science and engineering practices. And so if you go into the framework and look at their definition for engaging in argument from evidence, an argument goes beyond, it says, reaching agreements in explanations and design solutions. So it's an explanation plus, right? It's beyond an explanation. So students are expected to use argumentation to listen to, compare, and evaluate competing ideas and methods based on their merits. So an argument goes beyond an explanation in that you start to compare different explanations and support one or the other based on their merits. So, and scientists and engineers do this all the time. And I think, by the time you're, through 4 years of engineering school or whatever, you just kind of do it and you don't really think about what goes into that. But that's the difference between argumentation and explanation. And so they can kind of be used interchangeably a lot, but the difference in that skill is the argument is comparing different solutions. And so what we propose in the off the shelf is to have kids do that whole CER process and then add the argument piece if there is discourse around competing claims. And an argument is at middle school level may not sound much different than the reasoning statement, but it's going to be kind of couched in a little more persuasive language. Now, when kids get to high school in argumentation, they're asked to actually identify the competing claims and identify why they're wrong, as well as supporting their own claim. So that kind of rebuttal piece is in the high school, in the NGSS and the high school SEP bullets. It's not really in middle school. And so argument and explanation are going to look kind of similar in middle school, but the argument kind of has a different purpose. It's to be persuasive. And so we can think of CERs as being more expository writing and arguments being a little more along the lines of persuasive. So one of the ways that the NGSS and McNeil and Krajcik suggest that kids get better at CERs and arguments is not only just writing them from scratch themselves, but to look at examples and kind of break them down. And so this is also an activity that's in the off the shelf, but and this is adapted from the Krajcik book. So scientists write arguments. We have 2 scientists. So we have a scenario. 2 scientists are working on writing arguments to support the claim that polar bears are adapted to live in the Arctic. So the first thing they do is consider the same scientific principle. And so here's their principle: adaptations allow an animal to survive in its environment. Then they each list some polar bear facts as evidence, and then they connect the science principle to the evidence as their reasoning, and then they write an argument to persuade the audience. So here's their question: how can polar bears survive in the Arctic? The claim: polar bears are adapted to live in the Arctic, so they're using the same claim. The scientific principle is adaptations allow an animal to survive in its environment. So now we have two arguments. And again, I took most of this from the Kraychuk book and just kind of adapted it to our format. So we have scientist 1 and we have scientist 2. So I'm going to put you back in your group, your little group of 3, and I'd like you to decide scientist 1 and scientist 2, who wrote it better and why. So, and then on slide 32, you can record your thoughts. So scientists 1 and 2, who wrote a better argument and what's better about that argument? All right, thanks. So yeah, scientist 2's argument was a lot better. And kids will see that, but they, digging into why can bring up some great conversation. And, ideally you do this in a group or in groups in your classroom, and you might have 8 different, slightly different opinions. And so you can kind of pick it apart. But yeah, scientist 1, the evidence and reasoning was weak to begin with. And so then the argument was weak. And scientist 2 had much more factual evidence and factual reasoning without, opinions. And then the argument was solid. And the argument really isn't terribly different than the reasoning at this middle school level. But we were going to start it with maybe some sort of persuasive sentence starters. And so, we're trying to make it a little more persuasive. And so that is one of the activities that's in the off-the-shelf lesson that can help your kids think about argumentation, and also, kind of provide a good reason to get good at CERs, because, when you're good at scientific reasoning, you're just kind of running that CER in your head and then spitting out your argument. But for kids, they kind of need to lay it all out and then make their argument. So some sentence starters for arguments to make them a little more persuasive, again, leading up to high school, where they will actually be writing rebuttals. You can have them start with, it's clear that, we know that, the facts show. When you get to the end of 8th grade, I believe in 8-7, we have them do a little bit of counterclaim or rebuttal, and then you can use some sentence formats that look like this. So here are the bullets that are under the SEP in the appendix for middle school. So the ones that we're talking about here have to do with writing. So compare and critique 2 arguments on the same topic, which is what we just did, and then construct or use or present an oral or written argument supported by evidence and scientific reasoning to support or refute an explanation. The other ones really have to do with, this is, maybe happening during your productive talk kind of opportunities in the share. And then the last 2 really have to do with some of the engineering pieces that are in some of the MyStar units. And so that might actually happen, in that last lesson, the final lesson of a unit. But what we're talking about in this off the shelf specifically that's really related to CERs are these first 2. So that off the shelf lesson, it opens with a Seinfeld clip where George is arguing with somebody over parking space. And so we talk about, there's got to be a better way to have conversations where people disagree. Then we do My Dad is an Alien. We do a chores activity where kids construct an argument, and I'm going to just walk you through that quickly. We're not going to actually do it today because we don't have time, but I'll show you kind of what that's like. And then for the connect, we do the polar bear arguments activity, and then the check your progress is Jamal and the baking soda. So you're kind of familiar with that lesson now, if it's something that you want to use. So the chores activity, where kids construct an argument, is a lot of fun. And I've done this with teachers when we're face to face, and it works real well, and it works well with kids. So instead of doing something scientific, we chose something that is motivating for kids. They're going to have a strong opinion, right? And they're going to be really motivated to make this argument. So you start out by having the kids randomly name some household chores and how long they take. So, what are some things that kids are responsible for doing around the house? And you want to take about 8, somewhere between 8 and 10 chores, and you're just going to kind of record them in 2 columns, but you're not really telling the kids that you're doing that. And then what you're going to do after you've listed these chores is you're going to present the scenario where there are 2 kids in the family and they both want a raise, and the parents say only one kid can get a raise. We don't have enough money for 2 raises. So you take those 2 columns and one column is one sibling and one column is the other, and you give them names of kids in your class or whatever. And then the kids have to decide, looking at those lists of chores, who's doing the most work or the nastiest stuff or whatever, and who should get the allowance. And then, so we give them this modified argumentation format, and then we're going to do parts. And they're going to switch every time they write a part. They're going to switch partners and have a discussion, and they can take advice from their partner, they can steal ideas from their partner, and then we're going to write another part, and then they switch again. So it's called using clock partners. And so we start by having them write a claim, and it's always very easy for kids to come up with a claim. They'll be very opinionated over who's doing the most. And then they have to write down principles. What do you believe about chores? How should they be valued? Is it that they take a lot of time? Is it that they're gross and stinky? Or, what do you believe makes a chore valuable? And then they go visit with their clock partners. And then as you're going through this, you can stop and have debriefing. And so they're going to visit with their clock partners after the claims and principles writing. Then they're going to have a different partner that they meet after they write evidence, and a third partner they're going to meet after they write the reasoning piece. And then you can have conversations with your kids as they go through these processes, and talk about, what if people don't agree on the principles? You can maybe never resolve this argument, right? So it's really important to have common principles identified. Why is it important to include those principles in your reasoning? How does that make your argument stronger? And so they continue to, trade and get feedback from partners, and you continue to have these debriefings. So that's a great activity to do. Kids like it. They like all the movement. They like, talking to different people and stuff, but it's also a great way to lead them through that whole process of developing a strong argument. All right. A couple other classroom strategies, just tips and tricks kinds of things. When kids are writing CERs, especially if they're doing it in small groups, this NEWS peer review is really great, and you can use this for lots of things. You can use it when they're doing models and things like that too. But this is a form that we just have available. We use it in some of our units, but you can use it anytime. So you let the groups get just about done with what they're doing, and then you give each group one of these sheets, and they have to review, they trade papers basically, or trade posters, or trade whiteboards with another group, and they provide feedback to that group. What does the group need? What was excellent? What suggestions do you have? What do you wonder about? And then you go back and you let them take that feedback and make any revisions. And so you end up with much stronger products. Usually this is going to happen maybe at the end of the uncover, right before you go to the share phase. And so you end up with better student products for your share discussion. So peer review is a good technique. Using these kinds of sentence starters when you're doing productive talk during those share phases. Ask kids about their evidence. Ask them to explain their writing. Ask them, how can we use the scientific principles, those kinds of things. So keep, drilling that language and that thought process. And then this I stole from another MyStar teacher, and I thought it was really great. She does this with her kids every year at the beginning of the year. And you really could do this with, you could do it as part of that Seinfeld clip that's at the beginning of the anchor for the off-the-shelf lesson. But she has her kids describe, what does it feel like? What does it look like? What does it feel like when people are arguing? And the kids come up with a list, oh, you know, balled up fist, yelling, emotional, crying, pointing fingers, all of those things. And then you go through an activity like that chores activity and you compare it. You know, when you switched with your partners, were you yelling and crying and slamming doors? No, we were calm and explaining. We had calm voices. We agreed or disagreed, but we asked questions. One person spoke at a time, all of those things. And so she leaves these lists up throughout the year to remind kids that an academic argument is not the same as the kind of argument that might happen, you know, between, you know, your friends on the playground or, you know, at home with your brother or sister or whatever. And I just thought that was really cool. So I threw that in there. All right. So here's where I'm going to ask you for some advice. So in MyStar, we just did a kind of a survey about 3 or 4 weeks ago. We went through all of our units that have constructing explanations or arguing from evidence as one of the main SCPs. And we looked at what format we used in those lessons, and we've got a variety. And so and most of them do not match the formats that we developed in the off-the-shelf lesson. So I apologize for that. Every time I do this presentation, I'm like, oh, but when you actually get to the unit, it's not going to look like that. So we're trying to do something about that. So I'm going to show you some of the different formats, and then I'm going to ask you to chat about it. And, you know, what about these things? What's important that we keep the same? What is important that we include? What parts are important to include? Is it important that we keep it the same every time? You know, just those kinds of things. So we have this thing called CPAC, which one of our writers, Tony, developed. And he did it, he was trying to figure out how to make CERs easier. And so in the units that he worked on, which is a lot of 6th grade units, and then also 7-2A, he formatted the claim, evidence, reasoning as claim, principles, evidence, and then conclusion. And they're really highly scaffolded. And so they look like this. This is an example. So that's one format that we have, and that tends to be mostly in 6th grade, which I guess makes sense because it's very scaffolded. And then we have some traditional CERs, not necessarily in that same box format that I showed you, but it's the same piece, it's the same parts, right? Claim, evidence, reasoning, no principles. And those are in some of the 7th and 8th grade units. And then we have a couple of units, 7.5 and 8.1, that added that principle piece. So we've got problem, claim, solution, principle. Solution, principle, because they're evaluating solutions to the problem. And then place for evidence, and then reasoning and conclusion. So they kind of just used every word they could think of in there. And then the argumentation, the unit that we have argumentation separate as a separate piece, not just kind of mixed in with reasoning, is unit 8.7. And that's because we wrote unit 8.7 after I had done that off the shelf unit. And I worked on that unit and I was like, we're going to use this format. So there's an example from 8.7. So what I'd like you to do, if you wouldn't mind, is, you know, take a look at those and, you know, and from your experience in using MyStar units, and just give us some feedback. And I'm going to share this with the CD team then. You know, how important is it to standardize the formats? I mean, I kind of think it would be important to standardize them, but not everybody agrees with me. So is that important? Is it important that we add that scientific principles piece in each CR? How do you feel about the definition of argumentation versus explanation that I just showed you that we use in the off-the-shelf lesson? And then anything else that you would like us to know. So I'm going to leave you slide 54 to record that. So if you would just take, I don't know, 5, 10, 8 minutes, 5, 8 minutes, something like that. And just chat and jot down your thoughts, and then we'll come back and then we'll be about done for the night. But I would really appreciate the input because it'll help with our upcoming discussion. All right, thanks so much for that input. This will help us a lot. I do appreciate that. Anything else that um, you want to mention or shout out or remind us about as we go through to try to revise these?
I think one thing that we just talked about is the argumentation piece. Like we like that in 8th grade, but if when we put it in there, but not everybody does 8-7.
Yeah,
So it could be in a couple units and then it might be introduced a little bit earlier or introduced at all.
it is. Argumentation is an SEP in, I think, 2 other units that we found earlier in, one was, I don't know, one 7th grade and one earlier 8th grade. But when the curriculum people wrote it, they just had kids write something that was sort of like an argument in the reasoning box. Like they didn't separate it out. So it wasn't really well defined. Like there was no real um, kind of pointing it out to kids that, hey, this is an argument. And arguments are, designed to when you're comparing 2 different things, that they just kind of rolled it right in. Like, oh, well, they're kind of making an argument. Well, yeah, they kind of are, but they're not aware that they are, right? So and then kids do make arguments quite often in the final, like we said, when we're doing engineering solutions, a lot of the units end with engineering solutions and kids discuss, what makes the solution good or not good. And so probably what we need to do is call that out, that, hey, this is one of those argumentation bullets. It's not a writing bullet necessarily. But where did we have all that argumentation stuff? Yeah, these, evaluate competing design solutions. Holy cow, we do that all the time in MyStar, right? But we haven't identified that as, argumentation. So thanks. That is helpful, though. I agree that, we need to make it more clear for kids, do some more direct instruction. Hey, you're making an argument. Here's what that's all about.
Yeah, because I know, like, I'm sorry, because I know that for some of the unit challenges or when you're looking at that, and yes, arguing from designs, sometimes those end of the units, like you just want to be done. And
Yes.
sometimes I won't get to it. And I
Yes.
don't want to say that it's not important, but like, I think that there could be smaller pockets even within the lessons, like, especially like if there's like data and you have to come conclusions from the data. Like, I just think at the end of a unit, when you've already been through it for 10 weeks and you just kind of like, we need to get to the test and move on because they're done talking about water. Like how else can you put that in besides the tail end when you've kind of had unit fatigue and you don't want to miss an opportunity to have that because you just
Yeah. That's a great point. I tried to make that point when we were writing another unit just a couple months ago. It was not about argumentation, but yeah, they put a really great activity after the kids had presented their final products. I'm like, no teacher on earth is ever going to do that. Like, you're just done. You just are moving on. I'm like, yeah, but that's where it goes in the format. I'm like, okay, but I'm telling you, this great activity, no one's ever going to do it because
right.
We have unit fatigue. Okay, thank you. That is great. Great input. Anything else? All right. I do appreciate your time today, especially on a snow day. Thank you for coming. If you want to leave feedback about this presentation, you can there. We have some upcoming PL. Oh, I didn't even finish that. This one is about we have another new off the shelf on interpreting graphs. They hadn't named it yet, so I'd left it blank. So we have some things coming up. We are doing the phase 2 claim evidence reasoning, which is sort of similar to this. If you have somebody else who wants to know more about claim evidence reasoning, you probably shouldn't come to it again because it's about half of it is the same as this one. But and then we have a cool assessment series coming up on teaching your kids to take 3D tests. So like helping them kind of break down that structure and use it to their advantage. And we are going to be presenting at MSTA pretty much all day Friday. So you can look for our stuff there if you're interested. We do have our Facebook group still going. And that's all I have for you. Thank you so very much. If there's something you want to chat with me about, I'll hang out for a while, but if not, if you're good to go, I'm good with that. And please enjoy the rest of your evening.